Dawn had not yet broken on Friday, October 13th, 1307, when the knock came at the doors of Templar commanderies across France. It was not the cautious knock of diplomacy, nor the formal summons of church inquiry. It was the sound of soldiers armed with sealed orders, moving with frightening coordination. Within hours, knights who had sworn vows of poverty and obedience found themselves dragged from their beds, shackled and accused of crimes they barely understood. The operation was so precise that resistance was impossible. Someone had planned this for months. Someone had ensured there would be no warning. To the outside world, it looked like a sudden collapse. The mighty Knights Templar, once the financial backbone of Christendom, fell in a single morning. Yet historians have long been troubled by how flawlessly the arrests unfolded. No leaks, no escapes, no last stand. Orders sealed by the French crown were opened simultaneously across the kingdom, suggesting that secrecy itself was the most carefully guarded weapon. The question lingers: how did no one inside the church object in time? But beneath the shock and smoke, faint anomalies appear. In a handful of monasteries, arrests were delayed by hours. In certain regions, interrogations stalled before they began. Letters surfaced later, hinting at confusion within ecclesiastical ranks, as if some clerics had expected something else entirely. It is here in these cracks that whispers begin. Whispers that not everyone in the church believed the charges. Whispers that someone knew the night was coming. According to official church records, the case against the Knights Templar seemed airtight. They were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, engaging in obscene initiation rites, and worshiping strange idols in secret ceremonies. These charges, repeated endlessly in papal summaries, painted the Templars as a corrupted order that had drifted far from Christian virtue. On parchment, the verdict looked inevitable. But when historians began reading the trials line by line, the story started to unravel. Confessions appeared quickly, but almost all followed the same pattern. Knights confessed, then recanted, they confessed again, then withdrew their statements once torture stopped. Some described rituals they claimed never happened, using language that mirrored interrogators' suggestions rather than personal memory. Even medieval observers noticed the contradictions. If the crimes were real, so why did the stories change so dramatically from one testimony to the next? More troubling still were the gaps. Entire depositions vanished from the record. Witnesses mentioned by name were never called. In some regions, local church officials openly questioned the legality of the proceedings, only to be silenced or replaced. Papal envoys reported uncertainty, yet their doubts rarely reached final summaries. What survives feels curated, not complete. Historians remain baffled by the sheer imbalance. An order that operated for nearly 2 centuries across Europe left behind almost no physical evidence of the crimes it was accused of committing. No idols, no forbidden texts, no corroborated rituals, just words extracted under pain. The official narrative insists certainty, but the surviving evidence whispers something else entirely, that the truth was either inconvenient, incomplete, or deliberately buried, and someone inside the church knew it. In the margins of Vatican correspondence, far from the bold declarations of guilt, a single name begins to appear. It is never emphasized, never explained. It surfaces in annotations, procedural notes, and quiet authorizations that altered the course of interrogations. Each time the Templars faced questioning under church authority, this priest was there, objecting to methods, requesting delays, or insisting on canonical procedure. His presence is subtle, but persistent. What makes this so unsettling is who he was. not a radical monk, not a fringe theologian. He was trained in church law, yet trusted enough to be sent into one of the most sensitive trials in medieval history. That trust makes his actions harder to dismiss. He was not openly defying the church, he was operating within it, using its own rules as a shield. Why intervene at all? To question the guilt of the Templars was to challenge not only the French crown, but the papacy itself. One wrong move could mean excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the priest continued, leaving faint fingerprints on documents meant to condemn an entire order. Some scholars believe he was buying time. Others suspect he was ensuring something survived the purge. After the trials, his name fades abruptly. No promotion, no punishment, just silence. It is as if the record itself turns away, and that absence raises the most disturbing question of all. Was this priest acting alone, or was he the visible edge of a much deeper fracture inside the Vatican, one that history was never meant to see? To most of medieval Europe, the Knights Templar were simple to understand. They were warrior monks, sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their white mantles and red crosses became symbols of sacrifice and holy war. Yet this public image concealed a far stranger reality, one that becomes visible only when their power, wealth, and geography are examined together. Within decades, the Templars evolved into one of the most sophisticated organizations in Christendom. They controlled ports, castles, and banking networks that stretched from England to the Holy Land. Kings entrusted them with treasuries, as pilgrims used their letters of credit centuries before modern banking existed. Such influence required more than swords. It required knowledge, and much of that knowledge originated in Jerusalem. For nearly 2 decades, the Templars were headquartered directly above the ruins of the ancient Temple of Solomon. This was no symbolic location. Chroniclers describe extensive excavations beneath the Temple Mount, officially framed as construction and fortification. But rumors persisted that something else was uncovered below. Objects, texts, or relics tied to pre-Christian history. Later legends would whisper of sacred geometry, lost scriptures, even remnants of the Ark of the Covenant. The church never clarified what the Templars found, if anything at all, but their sudden rise, unusual autonomy, and guarded secrecy fed suspicion. Yet what if their mission shifted from protection to preservation? What if they discovered something that challenged church authority at its roots? In that light, the Templars appear less like simple warriors of God and more like custodians of a truth too dangerous to name. The charges leveled against the Templars were shocking, not because they were extreme, but because they were incoherent. Idol worship, ritual spitting on the cross, obscene initiation rites, these accusations directly contradicted everything the order represented. Even by medieval standards, they seemed absurd. The Templars were among the most scrutinized religious orders in Europe, embedded within church structures for generations. How could such practices remain hidden for 2 centuries? Contemporary observers noticed the inconsistencies immediately. Some bishops expressed disbelief. Others questioned why no physical evidence had ever surfaced. The alleged idol, often described vaguely as a bearded head, was never produced. Descriptions of rituals varied wildly between confessions. Knights in different regions repeated identical phrases, suggesting rehearsed testimony rather than lived experience. Most revealing was the timing. These accusations emerged precisely when the Templars' wealth and independence had become politically inconvenient. The crimes themselves felt theatrical, designed to provoke horror rather than withstand scrutiny. Historians now argue that the charges functioned less as truth and more as justification, a narrative dramatic enough to erase sympathy and silence doubt. If the goal was merely dissolution, simpler methods existed. Instead, the accusations were crafted to destroy credibility entirely. That choice suggests fear, not of what the Templars had done, but of what they might reveal if allowed to speak freely. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar no longer fit neatly beneath any authority. They answered directly to the Pope, bypassing kings and local bishops. They owned land, commanded fortresses, and moved wealth across borders with ease. In an era defined by fragile power balances, such independence was intolerable. Politically, the Templars were a problem waiting to be solved, yet politics alone fails to explain the urgency of their destruction. Orders had been suppressed before without secrecy, torture, or spectacle. The Templars' end was different. It was swift, absolute, and unforgiving. Silence was not requested, it was enforced. And that intensity suggests the Vatican feared consequences beyond embarrassment or lost control. If the Templars possessed knowledge that challenged doctrine, even indirectly, the threat was existential. A church built on divine authority could not allow alternative narratives of sacred history to circulate. In this context, destruction becomes preservation. By erasing the messengers, the message dies with them. And yet someone inside the church hesitated. The priest who intervened during the trials understood the stakes. His resistance was quiet, procedural, almost invisible, but it mattered. He may have believed that truth, once buried, has a way of resurfacing. And if so, silencing the Templars was never about ending a rebellion. It was about delaying a reckoning that has still not arrived. In the priest, who would later appear in the shadows of the Templar trials, did not emerge from obscurity. He was shaped by the very heart of the medieval church, trained in its language, its law, and its careful hierarchies. His education followed the most orthodox path available to a cleric of ambition. He studied canon law, the complex legal system that governed church authority, heresy, and obedience. This was not the background of a mystic or a dissident. It was the training of someone meant to serve power, not challenge it. Records place him early in administrative roles connected to papal courts, where legal precision mattered more than theology. He learned how accusations were framed, how verdicts were justified, and how procedure could be used to sanctify almost any outcome. Such men were valued because they kept the machinery of the church running smoothly. Loyalty, discretion, and silence were rewarded traits. Nothing in his early career suggests sympathy for condemned orders or dangerous ideas. That is what makes his later involvement so unsettling. When the Templars were arrested, he was not an outsider stumbling into controversy. He was already trusted, already vetted, already embedded within the system that would destroy them. He knew how heresy trials worked because he had helped enforce them before, which raises an uncomfortable question. What did he see in the case against the Templars that made him hesitate? Some historians believe his proximity to internal Vatican debates exposed him to doubts never shared publicly. Papal correspondence from the period hints at uncertainty, disagreement, and fear of political backlash. If the priest absorbed these tensions, his actions may reflect not rebellion, but conscience. A man trained to protect the church may have recognized that condemning the Templars would damage it in ways no one was willing to admit. And once that realization took hold, loyalty took on a far more dangerous meaning. The priest's name does not appear in bold declarations or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it surfaces quietly, Woven into the procedural fabric of the Templar trials, a request for delay here, an objection to a line of questioning there, a reminder that confessions extracted under torture violated canonical standards. Each action taken alone seems minor. Together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Trial records show moments where interrogations were paused unexpectedly. In several instances, accused Templars were re-questioned under different conditions, producing contradictions that weakened the prosecution's case. In the margins of these proceedings, the same cleric appears as the legal authority who authorized changes. This was not coincidence. Trials of heresy were tightly controlled, and interference was neither common nor tolerated. What makes his involvement remarkable is how carefully it was executed. He never declared the Templars innocent. He never challenged papal authority outright. Instead, he used the Church's own laws as friction, slowing a process designed for speed and finality. To those seeking swift condemnation, such precision would have felt like sabotage disguised as obedience. Some historians argue that his goal was not acquittal, but preservation. By insisting on procedure, he ensured records existed, contradictions were documented, and absolution remained legally possible. Others suggest he was buying time, hoping political pressure would ease. Either way, his actions suggest intent. In a system built on conformity, hesitation becomes a form of resistance, and resistance from within is the hardest to detect. To protect heretics, even subtly, was to invite ruin. Excommunication stripped a man of identity. Imprisonment erased him from memory. Execution was not unthinkable. The priest understood these risks better than most. He had spent his life studying the consequences of deviation, yet he persisted, navigating a narrow path between obedience and defiance. What allowed him to continue remains unclear. Some scholars believe he was shielded by higher-ranking figures who shared his doubts, but lacked his nerve. Others suspect factions within the Vatican were quietly divided, each maneuvering to protect its interests. If so, the priest was not acting alone, but as a visible agent of an invisible conflict. After the trials, the danger became absolute. His interventions had failed to save the order, but they had left a trace. Soon after, his name vanished from correspondence. No condemnation, no honor, just absence. History does not record whether he was punished or protected. That silence suggests something unresolved. Perhaps the Church chose to forget him because remembering would raise questions it could not answer. Or perhaps he fulfilled his purpose, ensuring the truth was delayed rather than destroyed. Either way, the priest stands as evidence that the fall of the Templars was not unanimous. Inside the Vatican itself, a belief fractured, and that fracture, once opened, has never fully closed. For centuries, the fate of the Knights Templar appeared settled, sealed by fire and sanctioned by the Church. Then, in 2001, something unexpected happened inside the Vatican secret archives. While cataloging neglected documents, a historian unfolded a parchment that had been misfiled for generations. It was dated August 1308 and bore seals that immediately raised alarms. This document would come to be known as the Chinon parchment, and its contents quietly detonated 700 years of accepted history. The parchment recorded a private hearing held by papal representatives with the highest-ranking Templar leaders. Contrary to public trials, this interrogation followed canonical procedure. There was no torture, no coercion, and the conclusion was staggering. The Templars accused of heresy before the world had been absolved by the Pope himself. Their sins, whatever they were forgiven. They were reconciled with the church. This revelation posed a devastating question. If the church secretly absolved the Templars, why did it allow their execution to proceed? Why did official histories continue to describe them as heretics when internal records said otherwise? The Chinon parchment did not merely contradict the narrative, it exposed a deliberate split between what the Vatican knew and what it allowed the world to believe. More unsettling still was the document's fate. It was never destroyed. It was hidden, filed incorrectly, forgotten just enough to remain inaccessible. Someone chose preservation over truth. The church, it seems, did not lose this document by accident. It buried it carefully, ensuring that absolution existed on paper, but not in memory. And once unearthed, the parchment forced historians to confront a possibility long dismissed as conspiracy. The Templars were condemned not for guilt, but for convenience. As scholars examined the Chinon parchment more closely, attention shifted from what it said to who had signed it. Among the papal envoys authorized to question and absolve the Templars was a familiar name. The same priest who had lingered in the margins of trial records now appeared unmistakably at the center of history's most explosive document. His role was not ceremonial. The parchment indicates active participation in the proceedings, confirming confessions, overseeing reconciliation, and affirming absolution. This was not the act of a distant bureaucrat. It was the work of someone entrusted with resolving the most dangerous crisis facing the medieval church. His presence confirms what earlier records only hinted at. He was never merely slowing the trials. He was safeguarding an outcome meant to remain secret. This discovery reframes his earlier interventions entirely. The delays, objections, and procedural insistence were not hesitation. They were preparation. He understood that public condemnation and private absolution were unfolding simultaneously. His task was to ensure the latter survived, even if the former could not be stopped. The official narrative collapses under this weight. If the priest helped absolve the Templars, then the church knew the accusations did not justify execution. The trials become theater, the confessions, a performance, and the priest emerges not as a passive observer, but as a witness to truth forced underground. What remains chilling is that his signature survived when so much else vanished. It is a quiet defiance preserved in ink, proving that someone inside the Vatican tried to leave a record for the future, trusting that one day someone would find it. The implications of the Chinon parchment are impossible to soften. If the Knights Templar were absolved of heresy, then their destruction was not justice. It was erasure. One of the most powerful institutions in history knowingly allowed innocent men to die while publicly affirming a lie. That alone would qualify as one of history's greatest cover-ups. But the role of the priest transforms the story from institutional failure into intentional concealment. He was not defending criminals. He was protecting absolved men whose continued existence posed a threat. The danger was not their actions, but their knowledge. Once reconciled with the church, the only remaining reason to destroy them was silence. This reframing explains the urgency, the coordination, and the brutality. The Templars could not be allowed to speak. Their absolution could not become public, and so history was rewritten while truth was locked away. The priest's actions ensured that the truth survived, but only barely. What makes this discovery so disturbing is its modern relevance. If the church could suppress absolution once, what else lies hidden? The Chinon parchment proves that history is not merely written by the victors, but edited by survivors. And the priest, now impossible to ignore, stands as a reminder that even in the darkest purges, someone tried to save the truth, not by shouting, but by hiding it where time itself might eventually reveal it. Once the Chignon parchment forced historians to reconsider the innocence of the Templars, a far more dangerous question emerged. If they were absolved, then what exactly had they been protecting that justified their destruction anyway? Medieval legends rush in to fill the silence. Lost gospels excluded from the Bible, scrolls describing an earlier human version of Christ, bloodlines that contradicted divine lineage. For centuries, these ideas were dismissed as fantasy, yet the behavior of the church suggests fear, not dismissal. The Templars were uniquely positioned to encounter forbidden material. Their headquarters in Jerusalem sat atop one of the most archaeologically dense sites on Earth. They controlled access, funding, and labor. Excavations beneath the Temple Mount were conducted quietly and without oversight. Chroniclers noted strange objects being removed, then never mentioned again. If relics or texts were found, the Templars would have been the first, and perhaps the only, to see them. What matters is not whether every legend is true, but that the Templars behaved like custodians rather than conquerors. Their secrecy was disciplined, their silence absolute. Unlike other orders, they left no theological writings explaining their beliefs. That absence feels intentional. The priest's actions reinforce this interpretation. He treated the Templars not as deviants, but as holders of something that required protection. If they possessed dangerous knowledge, preserving it may have seemed more important than defending themselves. In that light, their silence becomes a form of guardianship. They were not criminals hiding sins, but custodians guarding a truth too destabilizing to release into a world unprepared to receive it. The church's authority rests on coherence. Doctrine, scripture, and tradition form a single narrative that cannot fracture without consequences. Yet scattered documents from the medieval period hint at contradictions the church struggled to suppress. Alternative accounts of early Christianity circulated quietly, suggesting theological diversity that later vanished. If the Templars encountered texts supporting these versions, the threat would have been catastrophic. Such knowledge would not need to disprove Christianity to destabilize it. Even small inconsistencies could undermine claims of divine continuity. A gospel portraying Christ differently, a lineage implying mortality, a ritual older than the church itself. Any of these would raise questions no institution built on certainty could tolerate. The priest appears to have understood this danger. His insistence on absolution suggests he believed the Templars were not heretics, but witnesses. Buying time may have been his only option. By delaying trials and preserving documents, he ensured that truth, whatever its nature, would not vanish completely. Whether he intended eventual revelation or eternal concealment remains unknown. But his behavior implies awareness that some knowledge cannot be destroyed without destroying something else alongside it. In choosing preservation over exposure, he may have believed he was protecting both the church and the truth from mutual annihilation. Once absolution failed to end the crisis, the church faced an impossible choice: allow the Templars to live and risk disclosure, or erase them entirely. Silence could not be guaranteed. Even absolved men talk. Memories spread. Knowledge leaks. Execution became the final safeguard. This explains the brutality. Confession through torture ensured humiliation. Public burnings ensured terror. The spectacle was meant to close the story permanently, but it did not succeed completely. The priest ensured something survived. Documents were misfiled, not destroyed. Procedures were followed, just enough to leave traces. Truth was hidden, not erased. Survival did not require openness. It required patience. knowledge hidden in plain sight, waiting for a future no one could predict. The executions ended the Templars as an order, but not as an idea. And if the priest believed history would eventually circle back, then his actions achieved exactly what destruction could not prevent. The question that remains is chilling. If something survived once, what else, I say, those who may still be waiting, buried not beneath stone, but beneath centuries of silence, guarded by those who understood that some truths outlived the fires meant to consume them. King Philip IV of France did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy the Knights Templar. His obsession was forged slowly through debt, paranoia, and fear of losing control. By the early 14th century, Philip was one of the most financially strained monarchs in Europe. Endless wars, lavish courts, and administrative expansion had drained the royal treasury dry. The solution sat plainly before him. The Templars were not only wealthy, they were his bankers. They held royal deposits, managed transfers, and possessed liquid assets beyond the reach of the crown. Worse still, Philip could not simply seize their wealth. The Templars answered to the Pope, not to kings. That reality humiliated him. A monarch who ruled France found himself powerless before a religious order operating inside his own borders. The resentment festered. Historical records reveal Philip's relentless campaign to bend the papacy to his will. He pressured Pope Clement V through threats, political isolation, and implied violence. The Pope's position was fragile, dependent on French support. When Philip accused the Templars of heresy, it was not an act of moral outrage, but strategy. Heresy justified confiscation. Guilt unlocked treasure. The speed of the arrests reflects Philip's desperation. This was not justice pursued patiently. It was wealth seized urgently. Anyone standing in the way, including clergy, faced ruin. And that pressure did not stop at borders. It reached Rome itself, transforming a financial crisis into one of the most ruthless purges in European history. The Vatican found itself trapped between two intolerable outcomes. On one side stood a powerful king demanding compliance, wealth, and public condemnation. On the other stood an order the Church had quietly absolved. To protect the Templars openly would invite political catastrophe. And to abandon them would compromise moral authority. There was no path without consequence. Pope Clement V hesitated, and hesitation was dangerous. His correspondence reflects anxiety, not conviction. He questioned the methods, doubted the charges, and feared Philip's wrath. The Church's authority depended on appearing unified even when it was not. Public disagreement would expose fracture. It is within this paralysis that the priest's actions take on meaning. He did not possess the power to defy a king, but he could protect conscience where authority failed. His insistence on procedure, absolution, and documentation suggests someone inside the Church refused to let expediency erase truth entirely. The Vatican chose survival. The priest chose memory. In doing so, he became a quiet witness to a decision the Church would never openly defend. Protecting lives was impossible. Protecting truth, however fragile, was still achievable. And so the Church fractured silently, leaving history to judge the cost. When the fires were lit and the Templars burned, the spectacle satisfied the crown. Public heretics had been punished. Royal debts could be erased, political order restored. The Church offered no resistance. Silence became policy. But behind that silence, something else was happening. The priest ensured the story did not end with ash. Absolutions were recorded. Documents were preserved, not destroyed. Procedures were followed just enough to leave evidence behind. These were not acts of defiance, but of foresight. He understood that truth does not need witnesses immediately, it only needs to survive. The Templars died believing they had failed, yet our history remembers them as traitors. Yet beneath that narrative lies a second record, one never meant to be read aloud. The sacrifice appeased kings, but it did not erase doubt. The priest ensured future generations would have something to find. Silence was the price of survival, and survival in this case meant that the story could wait after the final judgments were delivered and the fires extinguished. The priests should have returned to obscurity within the church bureaucracy. Medieval clerics left trails, appointments, transfers, correspondence, death notices. Yet in this case, the record simply stops. His name, once quietly present in trial annotations and papal documents, vanishes without explanation. There is no mention of illness, no assignment to a new diocese, no official condemnation. For a man so deeply embedded in sensitive proceedings, the silence is profound. Historians searching Vatican archives encounter an abrupt void. Before the Templar trials, his presence is traceable. During them, it is undeniable. Afterward, nothing. Such erasure is not accidental. Medieval record-keeping was imperfect, but not this selective. When figures fell from favor, they were documented as examples. When they died, they were recorded. To disappear entirely suggests intervention. The absence raises uncomfortable possibilities. If the church wished to punish him, why leave no trace? If it wished to protect him, why erase him so completely? The records behave as if his existence itself became inconvenient. It is as though the Vatican chose not to remember. That choice forces a chilling conclusion. The priest did not simply fade into history, he was removed from it. And when institutions erase individuals, it is rarely because they were insignificant. It is because remembering them would require remembering what they knew. With no definitive record, historians are left with theories. The first is execution. The church, under pressure from the crown, may have quietly eliminated him to prevent further complications. Such punishments were often discreet, carried out far from public view. Yet even executions usually left traces, orders, financial accounts, or burial records. None exist. The second theory is exile. He may have been reassigned to a remote monastery, stripped of authority, and silenced through isolation. This would explain the absence of correspondence, but exile typically followed formal censure. Again, there is none. In fact, the third theory is the most unsettling. Protection. Some scholars believe the priest was absorbed into a hidden network within the church, one tasked with safeguarding sensitive knowledge. If his role was complete, disappearance may have been the reward for obedience. Silence ensured safety. None of these theories can be proven, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. History thrives on evidence. Here, evidence has been deliberately stripped away. The priest exists only where his actions mattered most. Before and after, he dissolves into nothing. This ambiguity may have been intentional. A man who knew too much could not remain visible. Whether silenced or shielded, his disappearance ensured that the truth he touched would remain unspoken. Every archival path ends the same way. Missing letters, incomplete ledgers, references without follow-up. Even modern scholars encounter restricted files and redactions when pursuing his trail. The deeper the search goes, the colder it becomes. This is not neglect. It is design. Someone at some point made a decision. This priest would not be remembered. His role would not be explained. His motivations would not be discussed. By removing him from the narrative, the church removed the clearest link between absolution and execution. Forgetting him simplified history. It allowed the story of the Templars to remain one of guilt and punishment rather than conscience and concealment. But forgetting is never perfect. Gaps draw attention. Silence invites suspicion. The priest's disappearance is not merely a missing chapter. It is evidence of control. When history erases someone completely, it often means their existence threatens the story that replaced them. And in this case, the story that survived required him to vanish. What remains is absence. And absence, when examined closely, can speak louder than any surviving record ever could. The official story insists that the Knights Templar were erased completely, their leadership executed, and their order dissolved beyond recovery. Yet fragments of evidence refuse to align with that ending. In the years following the arrests, reports surface of knights vanishing before capture, particularly in regions beyond French control. Scotland, locked in conflict with England and hostile to papal authority, became one such refuge. Portugal, instead of executing its Templars, quietly rebranded them under a new name. These were not coincidences. They were coordinated outcomes. Ships belonging to the Templars disappeared from French ports days before the arrests. Where they went remains unknown. No manifests survive. No destinations recorded. But rumors persist of voyages carrying men and chests of unknown contents toward safer shores. If the purge was truly total, how did these movements escape notice? This is where the priest re-enters the story. His access to trial schedules, arrest orders, and internal correspondence would have made early warning possible. A delay here, a message there, nothing overt, just enough time. Some historians believe he did not need to save the entire order, only fragments, enough to preserve continuity. Those who escaped left little behind. No proclamations, no confessions. Survival required silence, and silence, in this case, may have been the final act of loyalty to the order and to whatever knowledge they were sworn to protect. Long after the Templars were declared extinct, their symbols began to resurface. Carved crosses in remote chapels, familiar geometries embedded in later architecture, seals and insignia appearing in organizations that officially had no connection to the medieval order. Scholars debate whether these are imitations, coincidences, or something more deliberate. What unsettles historians is not the symbols themselves, but their consistency. The same motifs appear across centuries and borders, often in places linked to trade, finance, or secrecy. Groups that emerge long after the Templars' destruction seem to echo their structure: hierarchical, discreet, oath-bound. If the Templars survived as an idea rather than an institution, symbols would be the safest inheritance. They communicate identity without explanation. They persist without records. And they allow recognition among those who know what to look for. A coincidence explains some patterns, but not all. When symbols recur without clear lineage, they suggest memory passed quietly from generation to generation, waiting for those able to recognize it. The most provocative theory is that the Templars were never meant to survive intact. They were meant to transform. Destruction in name, continuation in function. A visible order invites scrutiny. An invisible one does not. If the priest understood this, his actions take on new meaning. By ensuring absolution was recorded, he preserved legitimacy. By allowing dissolution, he removed threat. What remained could disperse, adapt, and hide within new frameworks, banking houses, guilds, religious fraternities, structures that appeared ordinary but preserved older disciplines. Such a network would not announce itself. It would exist quietly, influencing without ruling, preserving without proclaiming. The priest's disappearance aligns with this possibility. Once transformation was complete, visibility became liability. If this is true, then the Templars were not destroyed. They were absorbed into history's blind spots, and the priest, remembered only through traces, may have been the architect of that disappearance. The Vatican insists that history is open to study, yet when it comes to the Knights Templar, openness ends abruptly. Entire sections of the Vatican Apostolic Archive remain restricted, accessible only to select scholars under strict supervision. Even then, permissions are narrow, and requests involving Templar-era material are often delayed or denied without explanation. For an institution that claims transparency, the persistence of sealed documents raises an obvious question. What is still considered too dangerous to read? The Church has released fragments, enough to suggest cooperation without full disclosure. But fragments are not truth. They are control. The Chinon parchment itself survived only because it was misfiled, not because it was meant to be found. That alone suggests other documents may exist in deliberate obscurity, preserved yet unreachable. If the Templars were fully resolved as a historical matter, there would be no reason for caution. Instead, restrictions remain centuries later, long after political threats have vanished. What remains then is reputational danger, documents that expose internal contradiction, moral compromise, or deliberate deception would challenge the Church's narrative of authority. Secrecy endures not because the past is unclear, but because it is too clear. Locked archives are not about protecting history from misunderstanding. They are about protecting institutions from memory. When asked directly about the Templars, modern Church representatives choose careful language. They acknowledge complexity, context, and medieval politics, but avoid specifics. The Chinon parchment is framed as an administrative nuance rather than a reversal of guilt. Absolution is downplayed, execution is treated as unfortunate inevitability. What is never addressed is intent, why absolution remained secret, why trials continued, why the Church allowed a narrative it knew to be incomplete. Silence fills these gaps, not denial. And silence in historical analysis is rarely neutral. Historical evidence suggests awareness, not ignorance. Correspondence shows hesitation. Records show contradiction. The Church knew the charges were unstable, yet allowed them to stand. Modern explanations gloss over this tension, preferring ambiguity to accountability. The priest's role is almost never mentioned. His existence complicates the story too much. A loyal insider who acted with conscience undermines the idea of institutional unanimity. It reveals fracture, and fracture threatens authority. So the Church speaks carefully, offering just enough truth to appear transparent while withholding the details that would force difficult questions. Silence in this case is not absence. It is strategy. Scholars who pursue the priest's trail often encounter unexpected resistance. Research requests stall, funding disappears, access is quietly revoked, no explicit censorship occurs, yet progress becomes impossible. Careers depend on cooperation, and cooperation has limits. Some historians describe being warned indirectly. Others find crucial documents suddenly unavailable. The pattern is subtle but consistent. Inquiry is tolerated only up to a point. Beyond that, doors close. This does not prove conspiracy. It proves sensitivity. Certain questions remain unwelcome even now, and the priest remains one of them. When investigation itself triggers resistance, It suggests the past still carries weight. History, it seems, is allowed to be studied so long as it does not ask the wrong questions. History has never agreed on how to remember the priest. To some, he appears as a traitor who undermined authority during a moment of crisis. To others, he was a loyal servant navigating impossible pressures with quiet integrity. And to a growing number of historians, he stands as something rarer, a guardian of truth who understood that survival sometimes requires concealment. His actions resist simple judgment. He did not openly defy the church, nor did he fully submit to its most destructive demands. Instead, he operated in the narrow space between obedience and conscience, using law as both shield and signal. That ambiguity feels deliberate. Clear heroes are celebrated, clear villains are condemned. Those who blur the line are easier to forget. If the priest had wanted recognition, he failed. If he sought rebellion, he never committed it openly. What remains is a pattern of choices that protected people, preserved records, and accepted personal erasure as the cost. That does not fit comfortably into institutional history, which prefers clarity over nuance. Perhaps history cannot decide who he was because he never allowed himself to be one thing. Protector, traitor, guardian, each label captures part of the truth, but none contain it fully. And that may have been his final, quiet act of resistance, ensuring that his legacy, like the truth he guarded, could never be reduced to a single, manageable explanation. In choosing obscurity, he ensured debate would endure long after institutions closed ranks, and declared the matter settled, forever unresolved. What if the Knights Templar were not wrong, but simply early? And what if the knowledge they encountered was not heretical, but inconvenient to a church still defining itself? These questions linger because no definitive refutation ever emerged. The Templars were destroyed, not disproven. If even fragments of what they protected survived, the implications remain profound. Alternative histories of Christianity would not erase faith, but they would reshape it. Authority would shift from certainty to interpretation. Power would weaken as mystery expanded. Institutions built on absolute answers rarely survive such transitions intact. The priest may have understood this. By preserving records and enabling survival, he allowed the possibility of future reckoning without forcing one prematurely. Knowledge revealed too early can destabilize societies unprepared to absorb it. Hidden knowledge, by contrast, waits. Modern fascination with the Templars reflects this unresolved tension. People sense that something ended without closure. The questions were silenced rather than answered. The continued interest is not obsession with conspiracy, but discomfort with incompleteness. If the Templars were right about even a portion of what they guarded, history has been living with a carefully managed absence, and absence has consequences. It shapes belief, doubt, and curiosity alike. The truth, if it still exists, has not disappeared. It has simply been delayed, waiting for a world capable of confronting it without fear. Until then, speculation fills the void, reminding us that unanswered history exerts influence long after events themselves have ended and continues to shape belief, skepticism, and longing today. The story of the priest and the Templars does not conclude with discovery or revelation. It ends with unease. Documents surface, then fall silent. Names appear, then vanish. Every answer produces another question, and that pattern feels intentional. Some truths are buried because they are explosive. Others are buried because they are enduring. The difference matters. An explosive truth destroys quickly. An enduring one reshapes slowly, unsettling foundations over centuries rather than moments the Templar mystery, belongs to the second kind. The priest understood this. By choosing preservation over exposure, he allowed time to become the final witness. Time strips away fear, power, and urgency. What remains is meaning. If the truth survives long enough, it no longer threatens institutions, it challenges individuals. That may be the real legacy. Not a secret revealed, but a question preserved. The knowledge, whatever its nature, still matters because it still provokes doubt. And as long as doubt survives, the story does not end. It waits, patient and unresolved, for those willing to look into the silence and ask why it was created. In that unanswered space, history remains alive, breathing quietly beneath official narratives, and carefully maintains certainty that still governs belief today.